What are the most suspicious coincidences in history? Story 1. The British actor Anthony Hopkins, who shot to fame as Hannibal Lecter, was delighted to hear that he had landed a leading role in a film based on the book The Girl from Petrovka by George Pfeiffer. A few days after signing the contract, Hopkins traveled to London to buy a copy of the book. He tried several bookshops, but there wasn't one to be had. Waiting at Leicester Square Underground for his train home, he noticed a book, apparently discarded on a bench. Incredibly, it was The Girl from Petrovka. That in itself would have been coincidence enough, but in fact, it was merely the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events. 2 years later, in the middle of filming in Vienna, Hopkins was visited by George Pfeiffer, the author. Pfeiffer mentioned that he did not have a copy of his own book. He had lent the last one, containing his own annotations, to a friend who had lost it somewhere in London. With mounting astonishment, Hopkins handed Pfeiffer the book he had found. "Is this the one?" he asked, with the notes scribbled in the margins. It was the same book. Story 2. Every 76 years, Halley's Comet soars past Earth, where it's visible to the naked eye. Now, Mark Twain was born in 1 year of its passing, in 1835. By 1909, he predicted he'd die the next year, when the comet passed again. The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together. The New York Times quotes him as saying, Twain's prediction ended up correct. He died one day after the comet's closest approach in 1910. Story 3. The Wreck of the Titan, or Futility Book, pretty much exactly predicts the sinking of the RMS Titanic 14 years before its actual sinking. The ship was called the Titan. It was also the largest ship afloat at the time. Both had a shortage of lifeboats, and both sank after being hit by an iceberg. Still not enough for you? The Titan sank in April in the North Atlantic in the story, and so did the Titanic in real life. Story 4. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. After the first attempt had failed miserably and several of the assassins had been killed, the sole survivor, Gavrilo Princip, was in a restaurant or cafe when lo and behold the Archduke's car pulled to a stop outside, well off his planned route. It was almost as if he was as fated to die. Story 5. Both Bach and Handel had their deaths brought about due to being operated on by the same oculist. John Taylor was an absolute quack and claimed that the surgeries on these composers were major successes, but they both had huge health issues after the procedures. Their sight and overall health ended up degrading, and they passed away. How this can be a huge coincidence, I'll never know. Maybe someone wanted to silence these giants of the Baroque era for whatever unknown reason. Story 6. Afghanistan pre-Taliban produced most of the world's opium. After the Taliban took over, in the late 90s, they outlawed growing poppies for drug production. After the U.S. invaded, farmers started growing poppies for drug production again, but with U.S. soldiers guarding their fields. At the same time as the conflict in Afghanistan was going on, the opioid crisis was getting out of control in America. 20 years later, some of the families that profited from the opioid crisis are being sued and losing in courts. Around the same time this is happening, the U.S. suddenly announces its withdrawal from Afghanistan. I have no sources for any of this, and a quick Google may debunk some or all of this, but it all just seems too convenient to me. Story 7. Okay, you've read about Nixon spying on the Democrats, but the creeps were the Committee for the Re-election of the President, sort of the blueprint for today's super PACs. A large group of rich, influential people gathered for the sole reason of getting Nixon a second term. These creeps funded the break-in at the DNC and later paid the legal fees for the burglars. Their dirty money was all over the scandal. Deep Throat was the whistleblower who informed the press. In the end, 69 people were indicted in the scandal. Nixon resigned. Ford pardoned him. And the missing 18 minutes of tape is allegedly a conversation that could have put Nixon and his conspirators away forever. Look, the whole scandal's fascinating on several levels. Read up on it. Story 8, Pearl Harbor and the aircraft carriers at sea. Speculation was that Franklin D. Roosevelt knew about the incoming Japanese attack on the base at Pearl Harbor and sent all the aircraft carriers to sea to prevent them from being destroyed. The loss of the carriers would have made naval combat extremely difficult in the Pacific if they were all destroyed. So it was convenient that all of them were out on a training exercise the morning of the attack. Obviously, this is pure speculation, but it was an interesting theory I came across while studying the event. If Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the attack was coming, he would have just warned the base to be on alert. A successfully repelled attack works just as well for starting a war as a complete disaster of a defeat, and a complete disaster is what it was. The carriers survived, yes, but the bulk of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. They were reduced to hit-and-run guerrilla raids, while the Japanese ran rampant across the ocean for the next 6 months. The U.S. was forced to concede all of its Pacific territory, including the strategically vital Philippines. Tens of thousands of American soldiers died or were taken prisoner when the Philippines was conquered, to say nothing of the millions of native Filipinos who depended on American protection. Story 9. Larry Silverstein, the tycoon who just got a lease and insured the World Trade Center towers, and who spends most of his morning having breakfast on the World Trade Center, North Tower, was not in the building during the September 11th attack, due to his wife insisting on a medical appointment. Story 10. Afghan. Poppy production had been all but eliminated in 2000. Almost immediately after the U.S. invasion, production exploded, and the opioid epidemic took off like wildfire. The same people in power during the flooding of black communities with crack in the 1980s were in power in the 2000s when rural communities got flooded with opiates. Big Pharma raked in billions. Once the prescribing of opiates got essentially regulated into moderation, the companies got a token fine, and the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. Story 11 $2 billion anonymous order placed for the U.S. Treasury on 0910. Can't do that today before Christ of Know Your Christ, Patriot Act, etc. But fairly common practice pre-9/11. Massive shorts placed on American Airlines and United that were also never covered or claimed after trading resumed. For those that don't understand the Treasury order, it's a massive flight to safety bet in the event of market uncertainty and suspension of operations. Whoever placed it made about $20 billion profit that went unclaimed. My guess, a member of the Saudi royal family that got last-minute cold feet about possible investigation, considering the timing, and bailed on it. Story 12. Okay, I'm surprised nobody has mentioned this before. The coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy are profound. Both presidents were shot, and their wives were next to them when it happened. Both implemented, or their legacies did, dramatic changes in racial standards. Both presidents were shot when the year was in the 60s. Both were elected to Congress in the year of 46. Both were elected in the year of 60 to be president. Both of their wives had lost a child while in the White House. Both presidents were shot on a Friday. Both of the assassins were killed before being brought to trial. Lincoln was shot at Ford Theater, and Kennedy was shot in a Ford. Story 13. Well, it's a fascinating coincidence that the Bush family and the Hinckley family were neighbors and associated with each other. Another fascinating coincidence was after Bush SR left office. When he went to Saudi Arabia, he stayed with the bin Laden family. Yet another is the announcement of $2.3 trillion in lost money the Pentagon announced on September 10th, 2001. And apparently, the offices where they were trying to find the money were in the wing of the Pentagon hit on 9/11. By the way, this is not a conspiracy. Another weird coincidence, there was a X-Files spin-off called The Lone Gunman. The first episode was about rogue government agents wanting to crash a plane into the World Trade Center and to blame it on terrorists. This premiered 6 months before 9/11. Story 14. I don't know if this is suspicious, but I have a pretty wild coincidence to share. So, a couple years ago, my band played at a music festival held in West Virginia. While I was there, I dropped a pay stub on the ground somehow. A year later, my roommate and his girlfriend went to a festival held at the same place. They ended up camping at the same spot we had camped at and found my pay stub and brought it back. It somehow held up and withstood the elements. For my roommate to find my pay stub in a completely different state and bring it back was always something that was insane to me. It's definitely the craziest coincidence that's ever happened to me. Story 15. Quoted from Darren Brown's Tricks of the Mind. In one television routine, I told, well, slightly adapted to involve the protagonist's wife, the apparently true story of a car repairman who was out on call in the middle of nowhere. His work finished, he was walking back to his truck to go home. As he walked past a telephone box, it started ringing, and he went in to answer it. The caller knew his name and began talking to him about a business appointment he had the next day. The repairman, confused, recognized the voice. It was his secretary. He asked her how on earth she had known to call the payphone. She answered that she had called him on his new mobile. He explained to her that, in fact, she had called a phone box which he had just been walking past in the middle of nowhere. She insisted that she had called his mobile and checked the piece of paper she had the number written down on. It was then she realized her mistake. She had accidentally dialed his payroll number, which she had written down on the same piece of paper. The payroll number happened to be the number of the telephone box, which he just happened to be walking past at that time. Story 16. I've posted this one before, but it's worth repeating. When Henry Zeglin decided to leave his wife in 1883, she was so distraught, she ultimately took her own life. In an attempt to avenge her death, Zeglin's wife's brother shot Zeglin in the head, then took his own life. But unknown to him, the shot had only grazed Zeglin and embedded itself into a nearby tree. 20 years later, Zeglin was trying to remove a tree from his yard. He strapped it up with some explosives and lit the fuse. The ensuing explosion not only destroyed the tree, but also blasted the 20-year-old bullet out of the tree, across the yard, and into Zeglin's head, killing him instantly. Story 17. In 1858, a man named Robert Fallon was shot dead while playing poker because he cheated. He won $600, which was now deemed unlucky, so no one wanted it. They gave it to a new player who took Fallon's place. He turned the $600 into $2,200 when the police arrived. They demanded the original $600 to be passed on to Fallon's next of kin, only to discover that his son was, in fact, the new player who had not seen his father in 7 years. Story 18. There is a video bouncing around the web these days called The Strangest Coincidence Ever Recorded. It tells the story of a ship which sank in the Menai Strait off the coast of Wales on December 5th, 1664. All 81 passengers died except one. His name was Hugh Williams. Then, on December 5th, 1785, another ship with 60 aboard sank in the Menai Strait. The only survivor, a man named Hugh Williams. In 1820, on December 5th, a third vessel sank in the Menai Strait. All 25 aboard were drowned except, you guessed it, a man named Hugh Williams. Story 19. Thomas Midgley Jr., who first realized that adding lead to petrol would reduce engine knocking. Years of research later proves that he has single-handedly caused one of the biggest human health problems in history, and lead poisoning was a well-known thing even back then. He also went on to synthesize a chemical called Freon to be used as a refrigerant, to be fair. The available refrigerants at the time were pretty toxic. Freon's known nowadays as part of a group of chemicals called CFCs. Yup, responsible for the hole in the ozone layer. As a tripartite addition to his unfortunate inventions, he also became severely disabled towards the end of his life and devised a series of ropes and pulleys to get himself out of bed. It strangled him. Story 20. King Umberto of Italy. Surprised nobody mentioned it yet. One day, Umberto was eating at a restaurant when he saw the owner looked exactly alike. That wasn't the only strange coincidence. It was found out they were both born on the same day, in the same town, married women whose names were the same, and the owner opened his restaurant the day the king was crowned. On July the 29th, 1900, King Umberto was notified that the restaurant owner was killed in a hunting accident earlier that day. Moments later, an assassin shot Umberto dead. Story 21. A 10-year-old girl named Laura Buxton released a balloon with her name and address on it, which floated 140 miles and landed in the backyard of a house where also lived a 10-year-old girl named Laura Buxton. On the day of the meeting, the two girls wore essentially the same outfit, a pink sweater and jeans. The girls were the same height, which was unusual because they were both tall for their age. They both had brown hair and wore it in the same style. They both had 3-year-old black Labrador retrievers at home, as well as gray pet rabbits. They both brought their guinea pigs, which were the same color and even had the same orange markings on their hindquarters. It was almost as though these two Laura Buxtons were the same person. Story 22. Bobby Lane was drafted by the Detroit Lions in 1958. After he got traded, he put a curse on the Lions, saying they wouldn't win for 50 years. Not only did the Lions finish with the worst winning percentage in the NFL for the next 50 years and never make a championship game, but in 2008, exactly 50 years later, the Lions became the first team in NFL history to go 0-16 in a season. They went winless. Because of this, in 2009, the Lions had the #1 pick in the NFL draft. They chose QB Matthew Stafford, who lived on the same street and went to the same high school as Bobby Lane did. Story 23. Okay, here we go. About 20 years ago, a friend of mine wanted me to help eBay with his high-end audio equipment. from the early 80s, really nice stuff, original boxes, etc. Stuff was selling well. A few smaller pieces had to be shipped internationally. Last items were two rather large speakers, really nice cabinets, and original boxes the size of small refrigerators. Was really nervous because the high bidder on the last day was in South Korea, and we had no idea how we would ship them. As we watched the bids come in toward the close of the auction, there was one in Australia, one in Japan. We were like, crap, bid comes in the last couple seconds. USA buyer. Phew. Turns out, he lived in the same block as my friend. Their backyards almost touched. We literally delivered the speakers through the backyard. We had a hard time believing it ourselves. Story 24. My dad moved to Boston from Chicago in the early 70s when he graduated high school. He got a job at a local store where he met my mother. After a few months of dating, his mother drove out to visit him. He introduced her to my mom and they went to dinner at her house. When the two mothers met for the first time, they both realized they were best friends growing up, before my grandmother on my dad's side moved to Chicago with her family when she was young. There was no other connection for my parents to meet. It was random. And it just so happened that my grandmothers were best friends in grade school before one moved to Chicago. Story 25. Not a massively crazy coincidence, but quite a cool one, I think. I go for a walk every evening, and my usual route takes me along the canal towpath close to my house. I like to go that way because it's a scenic walk, and there's one particular stretch of canal that has a great view of Salisbury Hill, which is a pretty well-known local landmark. It's the hill from the Peter Gabriel song. Sometime last summer, I was out on my usual walk. At that time of year, the canal is busy with holiday makers and canal boats. I saw two couples sitting on the towpath next to their boat. They were chatting and listening to music. As I got closer, I realized they were listening to Salisbury Hill. I assumed they were listening to the song because they were sitting in the place with the best view of the hill in the city. So, as I walked past, I said something to them about being in the perfect place to be listening to that song, which seemed to confuse them. Turns out they were just listening to music on shuffle. But one of the couples was really taken aback because the song actually meant something to them. Like, it was a song they listened to often when they were first dating or something, and was one of their songs. They had no idea that they were pretty much sitting in the hill's shadow. It made their day. I gave them directions on how to get up to the top, and as far as I know, they went on a hike up there the next day. It made me happy knowing that it had made them so happy and had given them a cool holiday memory. Story 26. My roommate and I studied abroad in the spring of our junior year, me in London and her in Madrid. For my spring break, I visited her and then we both went to Berlin. On our last night, we both drank a lot and were honestly still a little drunk when it was time to get our early morning flights. We got lost transferring to get to the train and to get to the airport. It's like 5 a.m. A young man sees us struggling with a map and asks if we need help. He's like our age and also American. We tell him we're lost, and he shows us the way to the right train platform. We're chatting on the way. He's also studying abroad, but he studies in Dresden, is in an ROTC program back home, and is visiting Berlin for the week. It starts to sound familiar, so I ask where he goes to school, and it's the same university we go to. My roommate and I both yell, "No way!" And I even show him my regular university ID. Of all the people to stop and help us, what are the odds we managed to run into a person from our school thousands of miles away? Story 27. In 1992, I flew 1,500 miles from my home in NYC to run a marathon. At the pasta dinner the night before, I got to talking to the woman seated next to me. She was at the race to cheer on her husband and daughter, both seated at another table that only had room for two. We never discussed where we were from. She could have been local to the race, for all I knew. We dined and chatted and then went our separate ways. About a year later, I joined a running club near me for training partners and met many other local runners. 6 months after that, I attended the annual awards gala, which non-running spouses of team members also attended. And there she was. It turned out the running husband was someone whom I had known for several months by the time of the gala. He had never mentioned having been at that particular marathon, and at the dinner she had never mentioned being from NYC. Story 28. My parents got married almost 50 years ago. They both grew up in small towns, but in different states. They met, etc. Not relevant to the story. And eventually married. My dad's grandparents met my mom's grandparents for the first time at the wedding, and they sat down to chat at the reception. The grandmothers both had an interest in genealogy, so they started talking about the first person in their respective family trees to come over to the US from Europe. It turned out that the first immigrant in each family came from the same small town in Denmark and had come to the US at about the same time in the mid-1800s. S. Their records or information about who was who back in Denmark was pretty thin, but they think that the two immigrants probably knew each other before they left home, a few years apart. And about 125 years later, a descendant of each of the two immigrants met and they, my parents, married. Story 29. American writer Anne Parrish was in Paris at a bookstore and found a copy of an English language children's book, Jack Frost and Other Stories. She hadn't seen a copy of it since she was a little girl and remembered it being her favorite. So she bought the copy and went to meet her husband at a nearby cafe. She explained to her husband how much she had loved the nursery rhymes as a child and began to recite some of them from memory. As he was leafing through the book, the pages turned to the inside cover, and written on the inside, it said, Anne Parrish, and was followed by her childhood address. Story 30. I always think about the Battle of Midway, which was more like three big coincidences. Three Japanese aircraft carriers were refueling their attack planes on deck, as well as changing their bombs to torpedoes. This meant that planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel were all out in the open instead of in their fireproof storage area. At the same time, all of the Japanese air cover had been drawn off by an unsuccessful attack by U.S. torpedo bombers. The Americans were wiped out, but as a result, the Japanese planes were far away and at low altitude. It was at this exact moment that three squadrons of U.S. dive bombers, who had spent most of the battle lost and looking for targets, stumbled into the area and spotted the three carriers, lined up, unprotected, and loaded with explosives. A few minutes later, the bulk of Japan's offensive power in the Pacific was on fire,